Hello, advanced social psychology students. Welcome to our Unit 1, Module 3 video lecture. I believe there's going to be 2 of these for Module 3. And our topic for today is social cognition. So what is social cognition? Well, think about what cognitive psychology is. You may have taken already the Advanced Human Cognition course that we offer. If you have, you know that cognitive psychology has to do with how we think and process information. And so social cognition is how we think and process information about social stimuli. It's just what you think. We're taking everything that you learned in cognitive psychology and applying it to social stimuli. And so it's its own area within social psychology. So let's call up the PowerPoint slides and we can start going through this. Okay. So this is chapter 2 in your textbook. And to just give you an overview, I am going to keep really consistent with your textbook for many reasons. First, the idea here is for us to understand how we process information and think about social stimuli. First, we need to know how you learn about this stuff. So we're going to talk about operant conditioning, classical conditioning, observational learning. And I'm going to go into quite a bit of depth into these 3 things, mainly because it's really important if you graduate or when you graduate from this program. If you have a Master's of Science in Behavioral Sciences on a general psychology track, everyone is going to assume that you really understand classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. These are some basic psychology things. And not everyone who's in this course was a psychology major. In order to get into our MSBS General Psychology Track program, you don't need to have majored in psychology as an undergraduate. You don't need to have had any psychology courses as an undergraduate. And so I really want to make sure that you know this information really well. That's going to be important. I know if I ever hired someone, if anyone ever hired someone who's got a master's degree in behavioral sciences on a general psychology track, we're going to assume some knowledge of classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. So I'm going to spend some time talking about each of those tonight. It fits in really well, or today, fits in really well with social cognition. Now, of course, from all of this learning, operant conditioning, classical conditioning, observational learning, we are going to create schemas. And so we develop new schemas as we get new information. That's accommodation. And then we prefer not to change our information. Once we have a schema, we want to keep the schema the way we have it. So we prefer to change the information to fit our schemas rather than the other way around. And so that leads us, and that's the process of assimilation. And so we end up it leads to a whole bunch of biases and heuristics that we'll talk about. And that's going to be it for this video. There's a second video for this week in which I'm going to be talking about affect and cognition. Affect is another way of saying our emotions, our feelings, and cognition, of course, is our thoughts, how we think and process information. So in the second video, I'll talk about how our feelings influence our thoughts, how our thoughts influence our feelings, and then thinking about our feelings or cognitions about affect. Of course, that's what a lot of therapy is about, right? You think about your feelings in order to help you process them. All right, well, let's get started. That's the overview for this entire week's worth of information from social cognition. Again, following very closely with chapter 2 in your textbook, because the textbook is free. I know everyone has it. And so I'm really trying to help you really be able to highlight the key important pieces of information that you need to get from the textbook. Of course, you're responsible for everything in the textbook, but I'm really giving you the highlights here. All right, well, let's start by talking about operant conditioning. Okay, so operant conditioning, and many of you, especially if you've had if you were a psychology major undergraduate, you took a whole course in psychology of learning, and you can really skim this part because you're going to know this inside out. Okay, but you might want another reminder, even if you've been through it before. Okay, so with operant conditioning, we have a certain situation. And in this situation, the organism or the human being is going to give some type of behavior, emit a behavior. And that behavior will be followed by a consequence. And because that consequence is associated with the behavior, because that consequence follows the behavior, then that behavior is either going to be increased or decreased in that situation. The likelihood of that person emitting that behavior again in that situation will either be increased or decreased. So let's go through some examples. The situation is my son's room is a mess. Let's say he's 10 years old. His room is a mess. His behavior is he goes into his messy room and he cleans it all up. The consequence is I walk in and go, George, look at your room. It looks amazing. Look how clean it is. I'm just so proud of you. You did a great job cleaning your room. Now, that consequence of all that praise following his behavior of cleaning the room, if it ended up increasing the likelihood of him cleaning up his room again next time it was messy, then we'd say operant conditioning had happened. Another example, let's say I have a wicked headache. The situation is my head is just killing me. My behavior is I take 2 Advil with some water. The consequence is my headache goes away. Because my headache went away after I took the Advil, that's probably going to increase the likelihood of me taking Advil again when my headache hurts, when my head hurts, when I have a headache. So you can see that's operant conditioning taking place. Another example, I saw this a lot. You're in Walmart and there's a little, a kid going, I want candy, I want candy, I want candy. And the mom just bops him on the bottom and says, stop saying that. Because the mom bops him on the bottom, stopped saying that when the kid was going, I want candy, I want candy, I want candy. The mom's hoping that that the likelihood of the child going, I want candy, I want candy, I want candy, will decrease next time they're in Walmart. That's the hope. And if that happens, operant conditioning happened. The final example I'm going to give you. So when my daughter was in high school, we had a curfew. That's the situation. We had a curfew that she had to be home by, I think it was 11 o'clock at night. Her behavior was she showed up at 11:15. The consequence of not honoring the curfew was that the following Saturday, you're not allowed to go out at all. Because she couldn't go out, because she had the consequence of not being able to go out one Saturday, because this prior Saturday she broke curfew, should decrease the likelihood of her coming in after 11:15 or after 11 when we have a curfew that you have to be home at 11. If she's less likely to do that because she had the consequence of not being able to go out at all the following Saturday, then we'd say operant conditioning took place. Okay? So now when we get to operant conditioning, we name the consequences very specific names. So they could be positive or negative reinforcers, and they could be positive or negative punishers. So let's talk about what these are. So first of all are reinforcers. Reinforcers always increase the likelihood that the behavior is repeated in that situation. So one of the first questions you want to ask yourself if you're trying to figure out if the consequence was a reinforcer or a punisher, you ask yourself, did the behavior increase in that situation? Then it's a reinforcer. Did the behavior decrease in that situation? Then it's a punisher. Okay, so reinforcers increase the likelihood of that behavior being repeated again in that same situation. Punishers decrease the likelihood of that behavior being repeated again in that situation. Now, for both reinforcers and punishers, they can either be positive or negative. Positive does not mean it's good, and negative does not mean it's bad. We mean positive or negative in terms of the number line. So positive is something is added or given to the organism or the person. Negative means something is taken away. It's a negative number. So it's subtracted from, right? So a negative reinforcer would be a consequence in which something is taken away from the organism that will make it more likely for them to give that behavior in that same situation. So let's do some examples here. I'm going to go back to the examples and we'll try to figure out what kind of consequence it was. So the first example I gave, we're in the situation where my son's room is a mess. His behavior is that he cleans up the room. The consequence is, yay, oh, you're so awesome. Look what a great job you did cleaning your room. You're amazing. Best son ever. All right, we're trying to increase the probability of this behavior being given again. So it's definitely a reinforcer and not a punisher. The praise is a reinforcer. Is something being given to him or something being taken away? Something's being given. The praise is given to him. So the praise is a positive reinforcer, okay? The next example, the situation is I have a terrible headache. My head is killing me. I take 2 Advil with water. That's my behavior. My consequence is the headache goes away. That should increase the likelihood of me taking Advil and water next time I have a headache. So you can see it's increasing the likelihood of the behavior. The behavior is taking the Advil. It's increasing the likelihood of the behavior. So it's a reinforcer, not a punisher. Now, what is the consequence? My headache going away. So is something being given to me or something being taken away? Something's being taken away. So my headache going away after I take the Advil is a negative reinforcer. Something is taken away from me, the headache, that increases the likelihood that I'll repeat that behavior, taking the Advil, again in that same situation next time I have a headache. Okay. Let's do the third example. We're in Walmart and there's a little boy going, I want candy, I want candy, I want candy. And the mother pops him on the bottom. Now she's popping him on the bottom so that he'll be less likely to say, I want candy, I want candy, I want candy next time they're in Walmart, right? So this is a punisher. We're trying to decrease the likelihood of the behavior being repeated. So it's not a reinforcer. The spanking is a punisher. Is something being given to the kid here or something being taken away? Something's being given, a spanking, a pop on the bottom, okay? So this is the spanking to the I want candy, I want candy, I want candy is a positive punisher. Now, it's not positive in that it's good. The kid didn't like getting spanked. Lots of research that shows that spanking is not the best way to decrease a behavior. But it's a positive punisher because something is given to the organism, the boy, that will decrease the likelihood of him repeating that behavior. I want candy, I want candy, I want candy, the next time they're in that same situation, being at Walmart. Okay. And the last example, the situation is that it's a Saturday night. My daughter's about to go out and she has a curfew in high school that she has to be home at 11 o'clock. Her behavior is she stays out till 11:15. The consequence for breaking curfew, for staying out till 11:15, the consequence is that next Saturday she's not allowed to go out at all. Now that should decrease the likelihood of her breaking curfew. So it's a punisher, not a reinforcer. The behavior is coming home after curfew. She should be less likely to do that next time. So it's a punisher. Are we giving her something or taking something away? We're taking something away. We're taking away her ability to go out that next Saturday night. She can't go out that Saturday night. That's the consequence of breaking curfew. So having the ability to go out on Saturday night being taken away from you, that's a negative punisher. Okay, something's taken away from her, the ability to go out on Saturday night, that should decrease the likelihood of her repeating that behavior, staying out past curfew in that situation. You have a curfew that you're supposed to be home at 11 and you came home later. Okay. So hopefully this makes sense. Got some cobwebs out for those of you that have been exposed to this before. I'm sure you'll hear about it when you're taking human development. So if you sort of understand it and from the book you sort of understand it, but you're not 100% sure, remember you'll get it again in another course before you graduate. One thing that I just want to make sure you know, because I remember when I was sitting and learning this material, learning this material, I thought that it was all based on intention of who was giving the consequence. So, so I always went by, well, the mother's giving the child a spanking so that it will decrease the behavior. So it's a punisher. This person is, yelling at the child so that they'll be less likely to do it. So it's a positive punisher. But the reality is that it doesn't matter what the intention is of the person who's giving the consequence. All that matters is how the behavior actually changes. So when we really go to name the stuff, you actually have to look to see, did the behavior increase? Then it's a reinforcer. Or did it decrease? Then it's a punisher. And I can give you an example. Excuse me. My son, he calls himself an attention whore. He loves to be the center of attention, especially when he was little, he was this way. He was very interested. He loved being in stage. He loves music and theater. He's like a performer. He loves performing. And so wanting to be the center of attention and being a performer worked really well for him, correct? But when he was a kid in school and it was time for him to sit down, he didn't always sit down when being told to. So the teacher's saying, sit down. And he didn't sit down. He didn't sit down. Eventually, the teacher would say, George, would you please sit down? I've asked you 3 times. And of course, everyone looks at George, all the class, because the teacher's raising her voice and frustrated with him and sort of, well, the teacher is giving him this negative attention with the intention of decreasing his behavior, the behavior being standing up in the situation when I just told everyone to sit down. So she's intending it to be a positive punisher, giving him this negative attention with the intent so that, and it's a punisher, so he'd be less likely to keep standing. But my son was like, ooh, everybody's looking at me. He got the attention that he wanted. So for him, it was a positive reinforcer. It might have been negative attention, but any kind of attention felt good to him. So you can't do it by what the person who's delivering the consequence intends to have happen. You have to go by what actually happens. I know when I first started teaching here at Cameron, oh my gosh, I think it was 1992 or 1993. And I thought, it must have been when I was first an adjunct in 1992. And I thought the first time I went to pass out the exams, the person who got the highest grade, I thought they'd be so proud of getting the highest grade. So I announced, so-and-so got the highest grade in the class as I turned the exams back. And then I noticed that, and she got 100 on the exam. I noticed the next 2 exams, she didn't get 100. And later, as I got to know the student better, she was mortified when I called her out and let everyone know that she got the highest grade. I thought I was doing this great positive reinforcer. She had studied really hard. That was her behavior. The consequence was she had done well. And I was giving her public adulation or adulation for doing so well. But she was the type of person who did not want anyone else to know how well she had done. She was more private. She didn't like being the center of attention. She didn't like everyone knowing how well she had done. And so what I meant to be a positive reinforcer for her was a positive punisher. And she let me know that she would actually go through and mark a couple of the questions wrong just so she wouldn't get the highest grade in the class, because she did not want me to announce in front of everyone that she would do that again. So, and now, I've let teachers that came in after me go, ooh, don't give them, you really need to know what works for that particular person to know what's an appropriate consequence. What you might intend to be a reinforcer could be a punisher. What you might intend to be a punisher could be a reinforcer. So I always tell future teachers when they first come here, don't tell people the highest grade in the class, whoever got it. Some students don't like that at all. In order for operant conditioning to work, ideally, you know the organism or the person that you're giving the consequences to really well. So you know what will work as a reinforcer for them and what will work for a punishment for them. Okay, that's operant conditioning. Now let's talk about classical conditioning. And you might have noticed in all the examples that I was giving with operant conditioning, they were always voluntary behaviors. So cleaning up your room, staying up, taking Advil, saying, I can't have candy, staying out till 11:15 when curfew is at 11. These are all voluntary behaviors. But all organisms, people, squirrels, mice, pigeons, there are behaviors that are inbred in us, behaviors that we're born with. And even if they don't show up at birth, they'll show up without having to learn them. Okay. So think of blinking. You don't have to learn to blink. Salivating. You don't learn to salivate. Being afraid, being really joyful, getting sexually stimulated. None of those things do you have to be taught. They're like inborn. And they're inborn that when a certain stimulus is given, the response will happen. And we're going to call these unconditioned stimuli or unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. And for short, we call them US and UR. So if you put a puff of air in someone's eye, that's an unconditioned stimulus. It will lead the person to blink their eyes. Rabbits do it too. Puff of air, that's your stimulus, leads you to blink your eye. You don't have to be taught it. It will automatically happen. Okay. Another example is if we put food in your mouth, that's unconditioned stimulus. Food in your mouth, you're going to start to salivate. Unconditioned response is the salivating. Unconditioned response, I make a super loud noise, so two cymbals behind a baby. The baby, a loud noise, the baby's going to instantly start to cry and get upset. That's an unconditioned response. They're going to show fear. So unconditioned stimulus, a loud noise, unconditioned response, fear. Unconditioned stimulus, the baby's hungry and the mom comforts them and starts to feed them. The response is this warm, calming feeling calm. Might call it joy or love or feeling cared for. So these are things you don't need to learn. Okay, they're inborn in the system. Unconditioned stimulus will lead to an unconditioned response. But then there's a whole bunch of stimuli, what we call neutral stimuli, that don't lead to anything. So you hear a bell, nothing happens. You see a rabbit, nothing happens. There's a whole bunch of things that don't lead to any responses. We call them neutral stimulus, or neutral stimuli. If we pair these neutral stimuli with the unconditional stimuli, so we ring a bell and then give the dog some food, the dog will salivate. Ring the bell, then give the dog some food, the food will salivate. If we do this a number of times, this neutral stimulus, we're changing it into a conditioned stimulus. By pairing a neutral stimulus with an unconditional stimulus over and over again, it will lead to classical conditioning. So the bell followed by the food, salivating, bell, food, salivate, bell, food, salivate. Eventually, hearing the bell, the animal will start to salivate. Does that kind of make sense? When they salivate to the bell, we're not going to call it an unconditioned response because unconditioned responses don't need to be learned. They're inborn, they're inbred. Well, you're not going to be salivating to a bell unless it was learned. So if you're salivating to a bell, it's because of this classical conditioning, because of the association that was made between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Then we're going to call the salivating to the bell a conditioned response, the CR. So let's go through the example specifically with food and salivation. The reason why I'm using food and salivation as our first example is because Ivan Pavlov was the one who first discovered classical conditioning. He was a medical doctor who was interested in digestion. So he set up dogs where he could really look at their digestive system. And what he found is that in no time at all, graduate students who would be feeding the dogs would come into it, and all of a sudden the dogs would start salivating. And it was ruining his experiment because he needed to have the food in the mouth before they were salivating, but they were salivating to the graduate students. So he's like, what is going on here? This is insane. And so he started to study this, discovered classical conditioning, and now he discovered this whole area of psychology, and he's forever famous, having nothing to do with digestion at all. So he took this idea that dogs, if you put food, he put food powder on their tongue, they would salivate. He then took this neutral stimulus of a bell or a metronome, and he would ring the bell and then give the dog the food, give the food to the dog, and the dog would salivate. Bell, food, salivate, bell, food, salivate, bell, food, salivate, bell, food, salivate, bell, food, salivate. Lots and lots of pairings of the bell and the food. And in no time at all, he would then just ring the bell, and he learned that the dog would salivate. They're salivating to the bell. And then he realized, ooh, these graduate students have been associated with the food. So now they just see the graduate student and they start salivating. And there's lots of other examples that we can use with classical conditioning. One that I found hilarious when I was a graduate student and learned about it. So I'll use this as an example. So I believe it was Watson who did this. He wanted I'm going to do it this way. Okay, so he wanted to look at sexual arousal. So what he ended up doing is he knew that he asked for some of the male heterosexual students in his lab. He asked them if they'd participate in a study, and he said, sure. So he knew that if he showed these men a picture of a nude woman, they would become sexually aroused. So the unconditional stimulus is the nude women. The picture of the nude woman, the unconditioned response is the being aroused to the picture of the nude woman. A neutral stimulus is looking at a boot, right? Boots, shoes, boots. So what he did is he gave many, many pairings of, he'd show his graduate student the boot, a picture of boots, a picture of the nude woman, they'd get aroused. Boots, nude woman, aroused. Boots, nude woman, aroused. Boots, nude woman, aroused. Did many, many trials of this, and in no time at all, you could show one of his graduate male students a picture of a boot, and they would become sexually aroused. So the joke that was always told when I was going to school was that now these men were all in their 70s or 80s. So they said if you go to Dillard's or a shoe department of Macy's or something, and you see some old man all into the boots, it must have been one of the graduate students in Watson's lab. So I think it's a good example in that students tend to remember it pretty well. And it's another example of how these unconditioned stimulus that lead to unconditioned response, that particular USUR isn't going to show up till after puberty. So these are things that aren't learned, but they're not necessarily showing up at birth. But I think you get an idea of, them without any learning. The USUR association happens without any learning, okay? Then observational learning is the next thing that I want to talk about. And with observational learning, it's just amazing. Many people believe that we learn more through observational learning than through any other kind of learning that we have. And so I've got here a link that I really want you to watch. The Bobo Doll Experiment by Albert Bandura on social learning, and it's a YouTube video. So I want you to click on stop this video and then go to the PowerPoint slides and click this so that you can watch this YouTube video that really goes through observational learning, the Bobo Doll Experiment. It goes through the Bobo Doll Experiment. But the idea behind observational learning is that we learn a lot about how the world works by just observing what's going on around us. And some people really underestimate how important or how much you can learn through observational learning. So I'm just going to give you an example because it blew me away. So when I first started full-time at Cameron in 1993, maybe it was the next year, 1994. A woman who is a developmental psychologist moved next door to me in the office. And so we would go to lunch together quite often. And she was a vegetarian. So the best place for us to go to eat were these Chinese buffets that were inexpensive, where there were lots of vegetarian options. So the very first time that she went to eat, she ate with chopsticks and she was doing great. I tried to eat with chopsticks and it just made a mess. It went all over the place. I figured I'm not going to be able to eat much if I'm eating with chopsticks. So I dug in with a fork. Well, a whole year went by, 2 semesters of us eating together several times each week, of me watching her eat with chopsticks, but my never actually eating with chopsticks, my eating with a fork. And at the end of the year, she decided Cameron wasn't the best fit for her. She had gotten another job in Colorado. So she was leaving, and it was our last lunch together. We were both very teary-eyed. I was so sad she was going. And she said, to make this a little bit more fun, why don't we have you eat lunch today with chopsticks? Because it was assumed that I was going to make a mess again. We'd have a big laugh about it, and we'd send her off. I picked up those chopsticks and had no trouble eating with them. Hadn't practiced at all, but I had sat and watched her over and over and over. And what we think is going on is that there's some mirror neurons that we have. And so my brain, my mirror neurons were picturing what she was doing. And on some level, I was repeating those behaviors, like not physically, but mentally through my mirror neurons. And so then when I went to actually physically do it, I could. Okay, so I hope that gives you enough of a teaser where it makes you want to watch the Bobo doll experiment. Bandura was the first person to really look at observational learning. And that's the Bobo doll experiment is a classic experiment within psychology, especially social psychology, but also psychology of learning. And so if you've had this course, they're going to expect that you know that. So it's a great, stop this video and then watch that video and then come back here. Okay. Okay, welcome back. I hope you watched the Bobo doll experiment video and enjoyed it. So now we've now talked about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. And from all of this, you are going to have created, not just you, but people are going to have created representations of people's groups, situations. We have ideas about how the world works, and we call those schemas. So a schema is just knowledge about anything, people, groups, situations, concepts. It can be anything. You have a schema for what it is to go to McDonald's. You have a schema for what it is to do laundry. You have a schema of a cell phone. You have a schema of jewelry. We have a schema of a woman. You have a schema of an elderly person. Okay. So one thing that happens is I'm just going to use people, you're introduced to someone new. Okay, so all of a sudden you're introduced to Bob, and Bob shakes your hand. Well, when you're introduced to Bob falls into many different schemas. Like he'll be in a schema that you have of what it is to be a male. He'll be in the schema of what you have of what it is to be whatever age he is. There'll be a schema based on how he's dressed. So if he's dressed really preppy, you're going to have a preppy schema. If he's dressed very conservatively, you're going to have a schema for that. So you're going to have cues like that. His race, you're going to have a schema based on his race. So you've got all these different schemas. But when you go to process information about Bob, what schema are you going to use? And the research shows that it's going to be whichever schema is most salient. So saliency is the key. And what makes a schema salient? What is going to make it salient? If it's unusual. So the number one thing that's going to make a difference is if it's unusual. So I'm not sure that this is the best example, but I've used it in other classes and people, I think they understand it. My husband grew up here in Lawton, Oklahoma, where Cameron is, but I grew up in the Boston area. So when I take my husband home, we go home for Thanksgiving or Christmas to my home. especially when we were younger. People that first would meet my husband, once my husband started talking, they would almost always, the first thing they'd bring up is, you don't sound like you're from around here. You have a Southern accent. Now, I never think of Oklahoma as being from the South, but they clearly, because he spoke with an Oklahoman accent and not a Boston accent, that was unusual to them, and he automatically would get fit into their "you're not from around here" schema. That can make sense? And they'd start talking about that. So things that are in schemas that are unusual, that we don't see very often, are more likely to be used than schemas that we see all the time. If you see men all the time, then that's not going to be the schema that you're going to draw up when you meet Bob. Now, if you're in a convent and they're all women around and Bob walks in, then Bob being a male may be the schema that becomes more salient. Other things that make a schema salient is if the schema it has a lot of negative information. This, from an evolutionary perspective, makes a lot of sense. It's really important from an evolutionary perspective. We want to notice things that could cause us harm. We want to notice things that are negative. The berry that's going to kill us if we eat it, the tiger that's running toward us, or this person that we don't know that's carrying a spear. Those negative pieces of information that could make it less likely for us to live. From an evolutionary perspective, it's really good that we key in on those. So schemas that are associated with things that are negative are going to draw our attention more. Things that are colorful, attributes about the schema that are colorful, bright, or moving versus stationary also are more likely to grab our attention. So they're more salient. So those are the schemas that we're likely to use in that situation. Okay. Now, when it comes to schemas, so remember we said a schema is like a mental framework that helps information to organize, process, and store information about your environment, right? The representations of people or situations that we have. Well, what happens is that we sometimes need to create new schemas, right? So let's look at this graph we have here. I'm going to talk about accommodation first. So my existing schema is his four-legged dog is a pet. His four-legged pet is a dog, sorry. But then someone tells you this four-legged pet is actually a cat. So four-legged pets are not always dogs. You're now learning new information that doesn't fit the schema that you have. So what you're going to have to do here is create a new schema. When we create a new schema, we're going to actually be what we call accommodating what's going on. We're going to change the categories, create a new schema. So when we're young, we're creating schemas all the time. We're accommodating all the time. We're all the time learning new things and creating these new schemas, these new categories of what a schema, of what belongs in that particular schema. But after a while, and not that long, we really love to keep the schemas that we have. And so we resist assimilation. Assimilation is when you take the new information that you have, and you apply it to an existing schema. That's really what we like to do. We resist this assimilation. We don't want to be creating new schemas all the time, right? So what we'll do instead is we will use these biases. These biases will allow us to change the information to meet the schema rather than changing the schema to match the information. So let's talk about some of the biases that come up when we're doing assimilation resistance, okay? And the first one that I'm going to talk about is the confirmation bias. And we're going to talk about a lot of these, okay? But the first one is the confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is when we seek out information that confirms your schemas. So once you have a schema, you're then going to seek out information. So let's say you see me in class, and I know you're seeing me sitting because we're taking the class online. But if I were standing in front of you, I do trip quite often. I'm moving around, I get all excited about what I'm talking about. I might trip. So you see me trip once, you see me trip twice, see me trip a third time. You may then have this bias or this schema. It's not even a bias, a schema that I'm pretty klutzy. Okay. Then you're in town, you're in Latin at an event, and my husband and I are there, and we're chit-chatting around, we're mingling and talking, and I might introduce you to my husband. Oh, he was in my class, blah, my social psychology class. And then I walk away to talk to someone else, and you're there with my husband. And you might just bring up to my husband, boy, she trips a lot in class. Like sort of, is she uncoordinated in other ways? You're sort of trying to seek out information that confirms the schema or the stereotype that you have of me being klutzy. And my husband will accommodate you. He will absolutely say, I shouldn't use the term accommodate. My husband will absolutely help you out. I guess it is accommodation. Accommodation is correct. He'll tell you about how a lot of times when I eat, some of the food ends up on my shirt. And so when you seek out information that confirms your schema, you're likely to find it. And when you find it, you go, see, my schema was right. Then you're resisting the assimilation here. Does that kind of make sense? So that's the confirmation bias. And we all know this, what you seek, you find, right? So the confirmation bias, you're seeking out information to confirm biases that you have. And then you're more likely to keep the schema and you're biased to keep it rather than changing it. Another assimilation resistance thing is the belief perseverance effect. The belief perseverance effect is this finding that even when you are given information that contradicts a schema that you have, you will not change your schema. You will continue to believe in something that, that you have information that contradicts it. You will discard the information that contradicts it, and you'll keep believing what you initially believed. And one example that's used a lot for this is that, let's say you have an impression of, hopefully you can see a box here, an impression of a student. So let's say I tell you that the student, hopefully there's no one in this class named Brian, but there's student Brian, and he got an A on the exam because he cheated. So I've told you that Brian is a cheat. So your impression of it, I told you that he cheated on this exam. And from that, part of your impression is that Brian is dishonest. Now, because I've told you he cheated on the exam, you're probably going to come up with some other pieces of information that you're just creating. You might think, oh, if he cheated on that exam, I bet he cheats on his girlfriend. I bet he lies to his mom. He cheats on his taxes. All kind of making you still believe that Brian, cheats. He's not an honest person. Now, let's say the next class period that we meet, I tell you, you know how last time I told you guys Brian cheated? I was wrong about that. That A that he got, he rightly deserved. So I got rid of this, the only thing that was holding up this impression in the first hand. Now that I've done away with this negative piece of information, you should go back to thinking, oh, I don't know that much about Brian. My impression of him should go back to neutral. But it doesn't. Remember these other pieces of information that you kind of thought, like him cheating on his girlfriend or lying on his taxes, lying to his mom. You're probably still going to continue to believe those. That's what we mean by the belief persistence effect. Even though you started to believe that Brian was a cheat because I told you that he cheated on an exam, then when I tell you he didn't cheat on the exam, you should go back to neutral, but you don't. you will still believe that he's not very honest. And we call that the belief persistence effect. When you believe information, even when you're given information that's contradictory to it. Okay. And the last one, which of these that I just think is absolutely amazing, is the self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is when we create behaviors in people that are aligned with the schema we have for them. So with the confirmation bias, we're looking for behaviors that confirm our bias. With the self-fulfilling prophecy, we actually create behaviors in the person that are based on our perception of them, and then that confirms the perception that we have on them. We take that to say, see, I was right. Okay. The self-fulfilling prophecy is very much if you go back to the chapter 1 lecture, where we talked about Rosenthal's study, where the teachers were able to create in students behaviors that allow the students to increase their IQs. So the teacher's impressions or belief about them led the kids to actually act smarter and increase their IQs. And it can work positively like that, but I bet you have this. I can't be the only one that this has happened to. And I know it's not, because I brought it up in other classes and people will shake their head yes. Every once in a while, I'll be at a social event, sometimes with my husband, and I'm standing next to him, clearly as his wife. And every once in a while, a person will come by and they very much treat me like the wife of the husband. And they almost talk down to me like they think I'm not that bright. Right? So they'll be like, hello, it's nice to meet you. And there's just something about the way that they talk to me that makes me think that they think that, I sit at home eating bonbons all day, supporting my husband's job or something. I don't know. And lo and behold, I find when I go to talk to those people, those are the people that I'm stumbling over my words and I have a hard time expressing myself. Here I am with a PhD who spoke for a living until I retired, and I can't, I have a hard time putting a sentence together. They think I'm kind of dim, and suddenly I'm acting pretty dim. So their expectations of me, their schema of me leads me to give behaviors that are consistent with their schema. And so they're creating the schema that they have of me. They're actually creating behaviors in me to match that. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, so these are all, your book calls them assimilation resistance. Because of this schema, because of that, and for some other reasons, schemas can be very self-confirming. Once you have a stereotype or a schema about something, you really have to be bombarded with information that's inconsistent with it for you to actually change your mind and create a new schema. And here's some reasons why. Information that's relevant to a schema is processed more quickly than information that's irrelevant to it. Information that's consistent with a schema is given more attention and better remembered than information that's inconsistent with it. Now, there is a caveat to that if you've taken the Advanced Human Cognition course. If it's bizarre, like really inconsistent and really strange, then that's given even more attention. But by and large, consistent versus inconsistent, but pretty ordinary information, we're going to give attention to and better remember the information that's consistent with our schema, not inconsistent with it. Therefore, schemas are self-confirming. If I give you completely neutral information, you will find support for your stereotype. You will find support for your schema. Okay. One example is a study that was done by Hamilton and Rose. And they used they used the schemas of doctors, accountants, and salespeople. And what they would do is they would flash on a screen a sentence. They'd give a male name, like John, an occupation, a doctor, and then something about him, his characteristic, a personality trait. And you learned about lots of men, not just doctors, salespeople, and accountants, but a whole bunch of different professions. But they made sure that there were an equal number of sentences that described doctors who were timid, as there were doctors who were wealthy, as there were doctors who were friendly, as there were salespeople who were timid, salespeople that were wealthy, and salespeople that were talkative. I think I said before friendly, I meant talkative. Talkative is what they used. All the same number of sentences that described accountants that were timid, as there were accountants that were wealthy, and accountants that were talkative. So you can see these three different jobs, schemas for a job of doctors, salespeople, and accountants. And these three personality types or traits, being timid, being wealthy, and being talkative. There were an equal number of sentences describing these men with these professions having these characteristics. And at the end of seeing the 250 sentences with all different occupations and all different traits and characteristics, then people were asked, so how many of the accountants were timid? How many of the accountants were talkative? How many of the accountants were wealthy? And what they found was people, when given completely neutral information, found support for their schemas. They found support for their stereotypes. They overestimated the number of doctors that were wealthy, salespeople that were talkative, and accountants that were timid. So even when you're given completely neutral information, you will actually find support for your schemas because of the way that we process information when we have a schema. Okay. So, so you can see how powerful these schemas are, right? And processing information takes tons of energy. It makes us really, most of the time we're tired, especially you're taking this online class. My guess is that many of you are watching this video at 1 a.m. after you've worked a full day and put your kids to bed. You're tired, you're trying to process a lot of information. When this is over and you're watching the news or something, you want to use as little energy as you can. And so heuristics end up being a powerful thing that we use. Instead of choosing what to focus on, we'll rely on our heuristics. Heuristics work most of the time. Otherwise, we'd stop using them. Heuristics are mental shortcuts or rules for problem solving that rely on very little thought. They reduce our cognitive load. And most of the time, they lead us to the right answer. Now, we as psychology people, we know they exist for the times when they lead to the wrong answer. So we can set up experiments and see when they lead to the wrong answer, and that's how we know they exist. But most of the time, they get you the right place and don't cause you a lot of angst, a lot of cognitive load. They keep it real easy. So we especially use heuristics when we don't have time to think carefully about the issue, when we're overloaded with information, when the issue is not that important to us, or when we don't have enough, we have a little solid information to use, like we don't really know that much about it. So I'm going to talk about 4 different heuristics just to give you examples of them, okay? And as a social psychology person, you should absolutely know these 4, okay? So the representativeness heuristic, we estimate the likelihood of an event based on how well it fits with our expectations of a model for that event. Oftentimes that's a stereotype or a schema. So we have a schema of what it's like to be an engineer. We have a schema of what it's like to be a lawyer. So one of the famous experiments that looked at representativeness is the people would look, they'd have 100 index cards. The experimenter would have 100 index cards. And the participants in the study are told 70 of these index cards describe lawyers. 30 of these index cards describe engineers. I'm going to read one to you, and they randomly take a card out. And then they read the card. John is well liked by his colleagues. He does well in the field and is sure to make, says positive things about it, is sure to do well in the field, something like that. He's friendly and gets along well with his neighbors. Then they ask people, what is the likelihood that this person, John, is an engineer? And what is the likelihood that he's a lawyer? Which do you think he is? Now, if you do not fall into the base rate fallacy, if you were to pay attention to the base rates, you would remember that 70 of these cards were lawyers and 30 were engineers. So you would say there's a 70% chance that John's a lawyer and a 30% chance that he's an engineer. But that's not what people do. When you do this experiment with people, they ignore the base rates. And what they do is they look at what I've read. What I read, does that describe a lawyer better or an engineer better? And because the description is equally good for both, they'll say there's a 50-50 chance that John's a lawyer, a 50-50 chance that he's an engineer. But they're ignoring the base rate. And so that's why the representativeness heuristic can lead to problems. Does that kind of make sense? It can lead to errors, but a lot of the times it's correct. Does that make sense? Much of the time it is correct. People who match our stereotype or schema of someone who falls in that category, a lot of the times they are like that. And so it gets us the right answer a lot and saves us a lot of cognitive energy. Another heuristic is the availability heuristic. Ideas that come to mind easily will affect our processing of social information. So if it's easy to come up with it, then you're going to overemphasize how often it happens. Does that make sense? I think that this is a great video. If you'll stop this video and go to the PowerPoint slides and watch this YouTube video, I think you'll find it interesting. It's about how news shows will talk about different things. Also, the book Nudge discusses how you can easily move people toward a decision using this availability heuristic. If you remind them of a related scenario in which everything went wrong, and then remind them of a related scenario where everything went well, and you can actually get them to actually be more afraid of a bad outcome versus confident about a good outcome. Does that kind of make sense? The availability heuristic, an easy way to think about it, ask people what do they think is more likely for them to be involved in a car accident or a plane accident, plane crash. And people will say a plane crash, where you're way more likely to get hurt in a car accident than you are in a plane crash. But what happens is plane crashes are on the news and they're talked about. And so they're easily it's easy to think about it. They're available to you very quickly and easily. So then you overestimate how likely that is to happen. Okay. A third heuristic is the priming heuristic. Actually, before we go to the priming heuristic, really do stop and watch that YouTube video. Okay, so stop this, go to the PowerPoint slides, find that YouTube video and watch that. Okay, and then you can come back and we'll get to the next heuristic. Okay, I hope you watched that video and enjoyed it. Now I want to talk about the priming heuristic. The priming heuristic sort of is the cousin of the availability heuristic. Priming happens when things become more available to you because you've recently talked about it or thought about it. So things that are recently brought to mind become more available, and then because they're more available, it's just like the availability heuristic, okay? Some great examples of this are, I bet it happened to you. You buy a new car and suddenly you start noticing that car all around town where you didn't notice it before. I remember when my husband and I were starting to talk about maybe getting married, suddenly everyone seemed to have on an engagement ring because I was thinking, I wonder what my engagement ring I want it to look like. And suddenly when I found out I was pregnant, suddenly there were kids everywhere. It's like I never noticed them before. If you've had this psychopathology class Lots of times when students take that class and they start learning about the different disorders, they start seeing the disorders in themselves and their family members. So ideas that are recently encountered become activated, and then they're more likely to be called to mind easily, and then that ends up affecting the way we process information. And so I'd like you to stop this video again now and watch this next YouTube video about how recently used ideas can affect our processing without us even knowing it. It's an interesting video about coming up with a campaign. It might surprise you, an ad campaign. It might really surprise you. So please stop this, go to the PowerPoint slides, and you can click on this and watch it, and then come back. Okay, well, welcome back. We're now going to talk about the fourth of these heuristics, illusory correlation heuristic. And this is when we perceive a relationship between two variables that doesn't exist, or we see it to be much stronger than it actually is. We see a correlation, we see a relationship between two variables that correlate. That's an illusion. They really don't, but we see one. So we're seeing a correlation that's untrue. We see it to be much stronger than it actually is, or we see one where there isn't one at all. It doesn't even exist. And this is because we as human beings are amazing pattern finders. We seek out looking for patterns all the time. It's what we love to do. Our mind is seeking out patterns, and we will find them even in random events. Okay, and this particular heuristic is going to become really important when we talk about stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. And the example that's used a lot here in a lot of the textbooks when they're talking about illusory correlation, they'll use sports as an example. So let's say basketball, they'll talk about a player being on a hot streak. So a hot streak means that because they just made the last 3 baskets, they're going to make this 4th one. So it really says the probability of making this basket, given that you just got the last 3, is much higher than the probability of getting this basket, given that you just missed the last 3. Does that make sense? But what ends up happening is that there's no evidence for this. If you do this in they looked at professional sports. There's no evidence for this. So then they went into college level and then even high school sports. And when statisticians look at this, there's no evidence for hot streaks and cold streaks. We think it's an illusory correlation. Okay. So then there are other mental shortcuts we have too, such as framing. How information is presented can affect how it's processed. So when decisions are worded to emphasize an alternative's gain or loss, we'll try to, it's going to end up, it ends up affecting how we process the information. I love this example. Let's say you need a surgery. The doctor says to you, if you have the surgery, there's an 80% chance that you'll live. If you have the surgery, there's a 20% chance you'll die. The doctor's giving you the exact same piece of information. If you have an 80% chance of living, then you have a 20% chance of dying. They're giving you the exact same piece of information, but people process it very differently. So if the doctor says, if you have a surgery, there's an 80% chance you're going to live, many people go, give me the surgery. When the doctor says, if you have the surgery, there's a 20% chance you're going to die, most people go, I don't want the surgery. So how you give the information, how you frame it, will actually affect how people process the information and where they end up with. And the last of these is anchoring and adjustment. How you begin to think of information can affect how you process the information. I believe your textbook uses this example, or lots of textbooks do. Well, and I used to do it with students in class. I'll say to half the class, estimate what is 10 times 9 times 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. And they'll come up with these huge estimates. Then to the other half of the class, I'll ask, what's 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6 times 7 times 8 times 9 times 10? And ask for their estimates. and they'll be much smaller. Then I'll have people do it on the calculator, and it's much larger than either group anticipated. But you can see where they started. Like if you're starting with 1 times 2, that's 2, times 3 is 6, times 4 is 24. They come up with a number versus 10 times 9 is 90, times 8 is 720. They end up with a much bigger number when they're going to guesstimate. Does that kind of make sense? And of course, anchoring and adjustment you can use in your real life. I made the mistake of telling my children about this when they were young. Other parents read their kids' books. Well, we read books. But after the reading, we tell stories. I told them about interesting social psychology experiments. And so then they went back and used this stuff on me as they were older. My son was in college and wasn't doing well in a class and came home. I can't remember if it was Thanksgiving time, and said that he had failed all of his midterm exams. And of course, I wigged out like he knew that I would. George, it's the only thing you're doing in school. You're not working right now or doing anything else. How in the world did you fail all of your exams? So I'm all upset. And then he goes, actually, I only failed one. I got an A on several of the others and a B on another. And I'm like, oh, that's great. See how we used anchoring and adjustment? Had he just shown up with, I did well on most of my exams, but I failed one, I probably would have been upset that he failed one because he started with, I failed all of them, then just failing one seemed like a great deal. So yes. Okay, there are other biases too that I'm gonna go through these much more quickly, and then that's all we're going to talk about today or in this video, and then there'll be another video that's going to talk about affect and cognition. And so here are some more biases. The false consensus bias. This is when we overestimate the number of people that share our negative traits, behaviors, views. So if you ask people who smoke to estimate the number of smokers, they way overestimate it. People who regularly speed, they way overestimate the number of other people that speed. I'm a slob. I probably way overestimate the number of people that also are slobs and don't keep tidy homes. And false consensus helps us to feel good about ourselves, right? Everyone else, our negative things are ordinary, and lots of people share them. Okay, the projection bias. This is it's sort of the sister of the false consensus bias. We believe people share our views and opinions way more than they do, not just our negative ones, all of them. So people who hate raisins will overestimate the number of people that hate raisins. We think people share our views way more than they do. We project our views onto other people. Counterfactual thinking. This is when we think about events in the lens of what might have been or what if. So the example that your book uses that I just love is, let's say it's the Olympics and you've got the person who wins gold, they're in first place. The second place wins silver, third place is bronze. I think that's right, gold, silver, bronze. I'm sorry, gold, yeah, gold, silver, bronze, whichever, first, second, and third. Who should be happier, the person that won second or the person that won third? I would guess the person who won second would be much happier than the person who won third. Of course, the person who won first is going to be the most happy, but the better you did, the happier you're going to be. But that's not true. What ends up happening is the person who's in the second place, when they think of what might have been, they think, I might have won the gold. I might have won it all. And so they're really upset. The person who won third, when they tend to go, what might have been, they tend to do not, I might have been second, they do, I might have been fourth and I wouldn't have been here on the podium at all. I wouldn't have gotten anything. So the people who win third place are actually happier than the people who win second. It's this counterfactual thinking, what would have been. The overconfidence bias is exactly what you think it is. We're overconfident. We think we're better than we are. We overestimate our skills, our abilities. The optimistic bias. We think things are going to work out much better for us than for other people, even in areas where we're not that confident. So even if I don't think I'm a good writer, when I actually send a manuscript out, I'm more likely to think that, like if the publication accepts on average 80% of its article, or let's say it only accepts 20% of the articles it gets, I still think I have a good shot of it getting accepted. Why is that? If they only accept 20%, I should think my chances would be 20%. And if I think I'm not a good writer, then my chances should even be less than 20%. But that's not what we do. The optimistic bias, we're going to think that we have a good shot of getting our article published in that journal. And not just me, this is like everyone. I talk sometimes to students who are majoring in psychology, and I'll be like, on average, psychology majors after they graduate made X number of dollars. And then I'll ask them, how much do you expect to make, ballpark figure, after you graduate, so that you figure out how much you can pay for rent and all this other kind of stuff. And they all think that they're making well above average, even if their GPAs aren't that good. And so it's this optimistic bias. We all think we're going to be better than average. And it's not just students. My friend recently passed away at 78. And when we found out she had this terminal illness, we were like, what? What is going on? How could this possibly be? Well, in America, an average age of a female, given the date of when she was born, is 76. So she died above average. Why we thought she was going to live to her 90s, why we thought we had all this time together, it's the optimistic bias. We should have known, boy, on average, women born in her year in America lived to be 76. When she was 76, we should have been going, this is borrowed time. You know, we're lucky to get this above average instead of thinking we had all the time in the world. Optimistic bias. And the last one, the planning fallacy. Oh my goodness, do I have this? So the planning fallacy is we underestimate how long it's going to take to do things. So even creating this video, I thought I would be done much earlier than I'm completing this. Tasks take longer than we think they're going to take. And this can run into problems for us if we have tasks go one after the other. We end up getting behind because they take longer than we think. If we don't have time in there for relaxation that can be used when things take more time, we can end up in a world of hurt sometimes. So the planning fallacy is this bias that we think things are going to be accomplished in much less time than they actually are. Okay, well, that covers the first two parts of this lecture. We've talked about the learning, or these PowerPoint slides. We've talked about learning, and we've talked about schemas. And you now can go sometime this week to the next video and watch to learn about our feelings and thoughts and how the affect and cognition and how they affect one another. All right, thank you guys. Bye.